She collapsed in the snow on the side of the road, thinking that no one would stop. But a homeless man approached, bent down, and whispered, "Get up. I won't leave you." What happened next changed their lives forever. Watch until the end. Subscribe and write where you're watching us from. The fluorescent lights of Southridge Medical flickered faintly above the tired eyes of Amara Brooks as she leaned against the nurse's station, her back aching from the weight of the 14-hour shift that refused to end. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to her scrubs, and the quiet beeping of machines in nearby rooms pulsed like a reminder of how long she had been awake. Her fingers, dry from constant washing, curled around the rim of a half-finished cup of lukewarm coffee. She wasn't sure what hour it was anymore, only that her feet throbbed and her spirit had grown quieter with each passing hour. The hallway was mostly empty now, save for the occasional shuffle of orderlies pushing gurneys and the muffled coughs from behind closed doors. A faint voice crackled through the intercom, announcing something about maintenance in a part of the building she hadn't stepped into in weeks. Amara didn't care. She had seen more than enough for one day. Patients with nowhere else to go, families who couldn't afford insurance, charts that never stopped stacking. Her whole life lately felt like a stack of charts, urgent, fragile, and waiting to collapse. She rubbed her temples and tried to blink the fatigue from her eyes. There was still one last IV to check in room 308, and then she'd finally be free to go. At least until tomorrow, when the same cycle would start again. She'd stopped counting her days off weeks ago. They came too infrequently and disappeared too quickly, eaten up by errands, phone calls from creditors, and moments of silence in her cramped one-bedroom apartment that felt louder than any emergency room. As she pushed open the door to 308, the warm smile of Mr. Carroway greeted her. The elderly man with thinning white hair and eyes that sparkled despite the oxygen tube wrapped around his nose had become a favorite of hers in recent weeks. "Evening, Miss Amara," he rasped, voice thin but steady. "Time for your check, Mr. Carroway," she said softly, offering a smile as she approached his bedside. Her hands moved with a practiced ease, adjusting the IV drip, checking his vitals, making a note on the chart. "Still out there snowing?" he asked, eyes drifting to the small window behind her. She glanced back. The glass was frosted, obscuring the outside world in a haze of white and shadow. "Harder than this morning. Looks like the city's disappearing one snowflake at a time." He chuckled, coughing lightly. "Well, that's one way to make folks slow down." She nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere, on the cold, on the dark walk ahead, on the uncertain promise of a bus that might never arrive. She wrapped up her check, tucked his blanket around him with a gentle touch, and promised she'd see him in the morning. Except she wasn't sure she would. South Ridge's rotation had changed again, and no one ever seemed to inform the nurses first. As she made her way back to the station to clock out, she checked her phone. 5% battery. One missed call from a debt collector. 3 unread emails about utility bills. The screen dimmed before she could open them. The charger was at home. So was the rest of her life, or what remained of it. Her locker was cold to the touch. She changed quickly, slipping into her oversized coat that had once been warm but had since lost its lining. The zipper stuck halfway up, and she didn't bother fighting it. Her scarf was fraying at the ends, and her gloves had holes in the fingertips. She wrapped them tighter around her hands anyway. There was no point waiting for someone to offer better. In the break room, another nurse leaned against the vending machine, phone to her ear, complaining about her boyfriend's lack of planning. A third nurse sat scrolling through social media, laughing at something on her screen. No one noticed when Amara stepped out the back door and into the storm. The cold slapped her instantly, slicing through the thin layers of her coat and biting into her cheeks like glass. Snow blew sideways in sharp gusts, erasing the familiar outline of the city within seconds. She pulled her hood up and hunched her shoulders, starting the long walk toward the nearest bus stop. The street lights cast a golden haze over the snow, which had already begun to pile in uneven drifts across the sidewalk. Her boots, soaked from the day's earlier slush, squelched with every step. Her fingers went numb quickly, the wind sucking the heat from her body faster than she could generate it. She didn't let herself stop, didn't let herself think about how far it was. This was her life now, moving forward step after step because going backward wasn't an option. There were no family members to call, no friends with spare couches. She had made her own way through nursing school, paid her rent month by month, and climbed through every hardship with grit and silence. But tonight felt heavier. She passed shuttered storefronts, snow-covered benches, and the skeletal outlines of trees swaying against the wind. A billboard for luxury condos flashed images of smiling families. She didn't look up. The irony had long lost its sting. Her bus stop appeared in the distance, barely visible through the white curtain. She pushed forward, slipping once on an icy patch and catching herself on a street sign. Her breath came in ragged gasps, fogging the air before her. She reached the bench and sat down heavily, hoping, though she knew better, that a bus might still come. Minutes passed. The snow piled on her hood. Her phone finally died. She watched a single car struggle down the road and vanish. The wind howled. Her hands trembled uncontrollably in her lap. She thought of her mother, of her brother, of a life lived in service of others with so little left over for herself. She wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to simply stop, to let the storm swallow her. Would anyone at the hospital notice if she didn't show up tomorrow? No, that wasn't true. Mr. Carraway would ask for her. Maybe that was enough. She stood up, legs unsteady, and took one step forward, then another. Her vision blurred. Snow seeped into her shoes. Her body was beginning to shut down, warmth abandoning her skin in waves. The last thing she saw was a dim figure in the distance. A man pushing something, wheels squeaking faintly in the snow. A cart? A suitcase? She tried to call out but couldn't find her voice. The world tilted, and then she fell. The cold was no longer biting. It was distant, almost soft. Then came the sound of footsteps, closer, deliberate. A voice low and unfamiliar, but kind, arms lifting her, the sensation of being carried. And then, darkness, warmth. Not enough to burn, but enough to remember what it had once felt like. Somewhere, in the depths of her fading mind, Amara let go, not because she wanted to, but because someone, at last, was holding on. The darkness that embraced Amara after she collapsed on the sidewalk was unlike anything she had ever known. It wasn't the sudden kind that follows a power outage, nor the familiar pull of exhausted sleep after a long shift. This was deeper, insidious. A cold that seemed to seep beyond the body, curling inward toward the soul. Time lost its meaning in that void. There were no beeping monitors, no voices calling her name, no sharp scent of antiseptic to bring her back. Only snow and silence. But somewhere beneath the layers of numbness, a dull awareness stirred, a distant jostling, a murmured voice, something rough against her cheek, the sensation of movement. She wasn't sure if she was dreaming or dying. The boundaries between the two felt blurred. She wanted to open her eyes, to speak, to understand what was happening, but her body no longer obeyed her. So she drifted, untethered, suspended in cold. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. First, the sound, a soft crackling like paper or old plastic being folded, then the scent, something burnt, not unpleasant, like charred wood and cheap coffee, then warmth, weak, wavering warmth, but real, the kind that drew you toward it like a moth. Her eyes opened slowly, lashes crusted with half-melted snowflakes. The world was dim, lit by a flickering orange glow. A space unfolded around her. Not a hospital, not a home, but some kind of shelter. The ceiling above was unfinished, lined with beams and insulation. Shadows shifted across the walls. Her body ached all over. Her mouth was dry, her fingers stiff with lingering cold. She tried to sit up but faltered, her head swimming. Then a voice, not loud, not harsh, but unmistakably male and unfamiliar. "Take it slow." She turned her head toward the source. A man sat a few feet away, cross-legged near what looked like a portable propane heater. He was older, with graying stubble along his jaw and weathered features that bore the kind of creases earned only by long years and harder choices. His clothes were layered and mismatched, an old army-style parka over a sweatshirt, worn jeans, thick gloves with the fingertips cut off. Next to him sat a battered metal cart filled with neatly stacked belongings covered in tarp and plastic. Despite his ragged appearance, he did not look careless. Every item had a place. Every movement was quiet, deliberate. Amara's gaze moved to her own body. Someone had wrapped a woolen blanket around her, thick and scratchy. Her coat was draped nearby, drying. Her shoes lined up carefully near a small patch of newspaper. Her hands, though still red from the cold, had regained some color. She looked back at the man. "You passed out," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "Found you on 47th, near the bus stop." Her lips were too dry to speak. She tried again. Her voice cracked. The man reached to the side and offered her a plastic water bottle. She took it slowly, sipping as much as her throat would allow. The water was lukewarm and metallic, but it was the most welcome taste she'd had in days. "You're lucky I was nearby," he said, not with pride, but with the detached tone of someone stating a fact. "Another hour or two out there, and—" He let the rest hang in the air. Amara took another sip, then rested her head back against the folded sweatshirt serving as a makeshift pillow. Her mind began piecing together the moments before she collapsed. The endless walk, the snow, the pain in her legs, the dizziness, the defeat. She studied the man quietly. There was something about his posture that suggested alertness, but not threat. She had worked with addicts, with psychiatric patients, with trauma victims. She had learned to read people the way others read books. This man wasn't dangerous. Guarded, yes, but not volatile. "Who are you?" she finally asked, her voice still hoarse. "Name's John," he replied. "Used to be an engineer, now—" He shrugged, gesturing vaguely to the room. She glanced around again. The space was part of an abandoned warehouse, one of the hundreds scattered through the forgotten industrial veins of the city. Wooden crates were stacked along one wall, and a torn sleeping bag lay unrolled beside the heater. A few canned goods were neatly arranged on a low shelf fashioned from a broken door. There was even a small radio, though it looked like it hadn't worked in years. "How long have I been here?" "Couple hours. Thought about taking you to a hospital, but the streets are bad, and you didn't have ID." Amara instinctively reached for her coat, her work badge, phone, and wallet gone. Panic surged, but John was quick to calm her. "They're safe," he said, nodding toward a corner where her things lay atop a crate. "Didn't take anything, just wanted to make sure you didn't freeze." She exhaled, a tightness releasing in her chest. She nodded, not yet ready to say thank you. John stood, moved to the heater, and poked the flame with a metal rod, adjusting the angle. Then he poured hot water from a small kettle into a paper cup and held it out to her. It's not much, just instant broth, but it helps. She accepted it, hands trembling slightly as she took a cautious sip. It was salty and thin, but it burned a trail of warmth down her throat. The heat settled in her chest like a second heartbeat. They sat in silence for a while. The wind whistled faintly through the cracks in the boarded windows, and the heater hissed softly in protest. Amara's body slowly thawed. She began to notice things, like the faint smell of mildew, the softness of the floor beneath her, the dull ache in her left shoulder. She glanced at John again. He wasn't watching her, not exactly, but he remained aware of her presence. There was no curiosity in his eyes, no judgment, only something harder to place, a quiet understanding, or maybe a memory. "You said you were an engineer," she said, breaking the silence. He nodded. "A long time ago, civil mostly, worked on hospitals, schools, infrastructure stuff. What happened?" He chuckled dryly. "Life, choices, a few bad ones, a few unlucky ones, the usual cocktail." Amara wrapped the blanket tighter around her. She didn't press. She knew how stories like his went, knew that some wounds stopped bleeding on the outside but kept opening on the inside. "I'm a nurse," she offered. "I figured." "How?" "You were wearing hospital shoes, and your ID badge was tucked into your sleeve." She hadn't even realized. He was observant. More than that, he was careful, considerate. "I didn't think anyone would stop," she murmured. "Most wouldn't," he replied. She looked at him again. "Why did you?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered toward the flame, then to his hands. "Because I knew what would happen if I didn't," he said quietly. "And I've walked past too many people already." They didn't speak again for some time. The snow outside fell in steady rhythms, covering the world in silence. Inside the warehouse, the heater kept its vigil, casting long shadows on the walls. Eventually, Amara lay back down, the exhaustion pulling her downward once more. But this time it wasn't fear that accompanied her into sleep. It was something else, something she hadn't felt in weeks, maybe months. Safety. And just before she drifted off, she heard the creak of John settling into his corner of the room, zipping up his sleeping bag, the soft clink of a metal spoon against a can. The kind of domestic sounds no one expects to find in a place like this, but then again, nothing about this night was expected. And sometimes salvation comes in the form of a stranger who has nothing left, except the choice to care. The fire had long since burned down to a soft, pulsing glow, but it still exhaled faint warmth into the warehouse as the storm howled softly against the high walls outside. The snow had not stopped. It piled on every surface beyond the warped glass panes and seeped through tiny cracks like an intruder that refused to be turned away. But inside, in the far corner of the forgotten building, a semblance of shelter had taken shape. It was crude, makeshift, and fragile, yet it held. Amara stirred under the thick blanket that had begun to scratch at her neck, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The air was cold, but no longer biting. Her muscles ached, but not in warning. She blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to the low orange haze given off by the heater that sat a few feet away, its metal body dented and stained with soot. Her breath moved in thin clouds in front of her face. Across from her, John was already awake. He sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, knees tucked near his chest, sipping from a chipped enamel mug. He didn't make a sound, but she could feel his awareness shift toward her as soon as she moved. His gaze didn't carry the unease of someone with something to prove, nor the pity of someone reaching down from a height. It was steadier than either, watchful, present. She pushed herself upright slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. Her joints resisted with dull stiffness, and the bruises on her side, earned from her fall in the snow, made themselves known with a sharp pulse. "Mornin'," John said, his voice quieter than before, as though unwilling to disturb whatever peace had settled in the night. She nodded. The words didn't come right away. She wasn't ready to say them, not out of ingratitude, but because she hadn't yet named the feelings rising inside her. She had always been the one doing the saving, the one who found strength and motion in serving others. But now, waking in a place built from someone else's scraps and choices, warmed by the effort of a man society no longer saw, she felt disoriented. Not from fear, but from the strange sensation of having been noticed and helped. He poured her a mug of something, instant coffee, she assumed, and slid it across the cracked floor toward her. She took it with a grateful nod and wrapped her fingers around it, savoring the heat more than the taste. It was weak, almost watery, but it was real. They sat in silence for a long while, sipping their drinks as the wind moaned through the broken frame of a high window. Somewhere outside, tires crunched over ice, too distant to mean anything. She found her gaze drifting towards the far side of the warehouse, where John's belongings were stacked in deliberate order. 2 folded wool blankets, a duffel bag patched with duct tape, a milk crate full of canned goods, a pair of battered boots drying near the heater. The longer she looked, the clearer the patterns became. Nothing was wasted. Nothing scattered. Even the tarp covering his cart was tied with precision. There was discipline here. Structure. A kind of quiet order that reminded her not of chaos, but of someone who once lived by rules and still clung to their remnants. She set the mug down gently beside her and looked over at him. "How long have you been here?" she asked. He didn't turn. "In this place?" "Just a week or 2. Before that, the old train station off Mercer. Then an underpass near the riverway. Before that, I stopped counting." "Do you move a lot?" "I stay where it's safe, where the police don't come too often. Where it's dry, if I'm lucky." She nodded slowly, taking that in. "I've worked with a lot of people on the street," she said. "Back in school, we had a community rotation. I used to hand out Narcan kits under bridges. Talk to people with track marks and lost eyes. Then you've seen more than most. I guess." She looked at her hands. "But even then, I don't think I really saw them. Not like this." John didn't respond right away. He refilled his mug, then leaned back against the wall behind him, stretching his legs out. His socks were clean, she noticed. Worn, but clean. "There's a line," he said finally, "between sympathy and understanding. One's easy to feel. The other takes time. Time and closeness. You sound like someone who's been on both sides of it." He gave her a glance. There was no bitterness in it, only a tired acceptance. "Once, I sat on the boards of buildings that now throw me out of their lobbies. I wore a tie every day. I had a car that heated the seat before you even sat down. I had a family. Then one mistake, or a dozen small ones. Either way, it goes. And people stop seeing you." She wanted to ask what happened, wanted to press for the story behind the slow fall he alluded to, but something in his expression warned her off. Not out of secrecy, but because the telling would cost him more than it would give her. Instead, She shifted topics. "I never got to thank you," she said, voice low. "You don't have to." "I want to." He nodded once. "Okay." She held his gaze. "You didn't have to stop, but you did." John looked down at his cup. "I've walked by others before, people who needed help. Told myself I couldn't afford to stop, couldn't do anything. That night, I don't know, I saw you and something said, 'Don't walk past this one.' So I didn't." Amara exhaled slowly. She was used to people justifying their inaction. This was something else. A man just admitting he'd made different choices before and chose better this time. "You're not what I expected," she said after a moment. "Most people expect something else. No, I mean, you carry yourself like someone who's still got a plan." John laughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed faintly off the walls. "A plan? No. A rhythm, maybe. You survive long enough out here, you learn patterns. When the trash gets collected, when it's safe to ask for food, what buildings leave their side doors unlocked. It's not planning, it's listening." Amara smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why you found me. You were listening." He looked at her then, longer this time. "Maybe." Later, she stood and stretched, wincing as the bruises from her fall protested. He noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he moved toward one of the crates and pulled out a jar of peanut butter, a box of crackers, and 2 plastic spoons. Breakfast. They ate, sitting side by side on the floor, saying little. She told him about her job, how her hospital was overbooked, understaffed, how she'd seen 3 nurses quit in the last month alone. She didn't tell him how her rent was overdue, or that her power had been shut off for 2 days the previous week. Some truths still felt too raw. In return, John told her about the best public bathrooms in the city, the places where you could still get coffee refills for under $1, and how to use certain fire exits to avoid sleeping on concrete. His stories were filled with a quiet, resigned humor, observations made not to shock, but to survive. By midday, the snow had begun to ease. The warehouse grew brighter as gray light filtered in through the gaps in the ceiling. Amara stood by the window, watching a pigeon stagger through a drift. "I should go," she said. "You could stay until the snow clears," John offered. She hesitated. Her body wanted to rest, but her mind was already calculating how far to the nearest bus route, how late she would be if she didn't start walking now, how many calls from her landlord she might have missed. She turned back to him. "I won't forget this," she said. John nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." She gathered her things slowly. He handed her a scarf she hadn't realized had slipped from her coat. Their fingers brushed briefly, and he stepped back. At the door, she paused. If you ever need help, I can—" He shook his head. "Don't worry about me." But she did. She looked down, then reached into her bag and pulled out her hospital ID. On the back, she wrote her phone number with a pen she'd nearly forgotten she carried. She held it out to him. "Just in case," she said. He didn't take it at first. Then, slowly, he accepted it and tucked it into the front pocket of his jacket. They didn't hug, they didn't shake hands. There were no promises or exchanges of future plans, only a shared moment, a recognition. And then she stepped into the snow. It was softer now, gentler underfoot. The wind had calmed. The world, for the first time in what felt like weeks, seemed still. Behind her, the warehouse stood silent, hidden in plain sight. Inside it, a man with nothing had offered her everything he had. And outside, a woman who gave everything to everyone else had, for once, been given something in return. The sky had shifted by the time Amara reached the edge of her neighborhood. The gray light had turned pale, the way it does after a long storm, neither day nor night, just a hesitant in-between. Snow clung to street lamps and rooftops like frosting, and the roads were blanketed in heavy silence. Her legs ached, her hands were raw even inside her gloves, and the sting of returning to the familiar world felt sharper than she'd expected. She passed the corner laundromat, its lights off behind frostbitten glass, and the little diner that had long ago stopped serving anything after dark. Her apartment complex came into view like a memory she wasn't quite ready to revisit. Inside, the hallway was quiet, save for the buzz of a flickering ceiling light. She trudged up the stairs, each step echoing louder than the last. Her key stuck in the lock, and when the door finally opened, she was greeted not by comfort, but by stillness. The kind of stillness that follows people like a shadow when they live alone for too long. The heat had kicked off again. She could see her breath in the air. The radiator by the window hissed in protest but gave off nothing. She dropped her coat on the floor, pulled off her soaked boots, and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do first. The apartment was small. One room that doubled as a kitchen and living space, a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom with barely enough room for a bed, and a bathroom that never quite warmed up in winter. The light above her buzzed, flickered once, then steadied. She plugged in her phone, not because she wanted to speak to anyone, but because she needed to know what she'd missed. It blinked to life, stuttering between notifications. 3 missed calls from the hospital, likely about a shift change. 1 message from the landlord, terse and impatient. A few promotional emails from stores she hadn't visited in months, nothing from anyone who mattered. She went to the bathroom, turned on the hot water, and watched it sputter for a minute before a weak stream began to trickle out. She washed her hands, splashed her face, and stood staring at herself in the mirror. Her eyes looked darker than usual. Her cheeks were hollow, skin stretched too tight over tired bones. Her reflection felt distant, like a version of herself she couldn't quite place. After changing into dry clothes and microwaving the last can of soup from the back of her pantry, she sat on the edge of her bed, cradling the bowl in her hands. The heat from the ceramic seeped into her palms, and for a while, she just stared at it, not yet ready to eat. Her mind wandered back to the warehouse, to the soft hush of John's voice, to the way he had looked at her, not as a patient, not as a stranger, but as someone simply present. She didn't know what it was about him that stayed with her. Maybe it was the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, as if nothing could surprise him anymore. Maybe it was the way he had spoken to her, with no agenda, no probing, no pretense. Or maybe it was just the fact that he had been there when no one else was. She thought of the cold, the snow, the sharp edge of despair she had been teetering on. If he hadn't appeared when he had. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. The days that followed returned to routine, but something had shifted. She showed up for work, took her patients' vitals, handed out medications, and filed reports. She smiled when expected, nodded when needed, and kept moving forward. But underneath it all was a quiet hum, a thread of memory she could not cut loose. Every time she walked past the bus stop where she'd collapsed, she felt her breath catch just for a moment. Every time she heard the wind howl outside the hospital's windows, she remembered the warmth of a stranger's blanket and the sound of metal clicking softly near a propane heater. A week after the storm, she found herself lingering by the public library during her lunch break, glancing across the street at a boarded-up warehouse half covered in snow. She didn't know if it was the same one. Maybe it didn't matter. She didn't go inside. Just stood there, letting the cold creep up her arms as she stared at it, feeling something between longing and guilt. Back home, one evening, she found the ID card she had given John resting on her counter where she had dropped her bag. She turned it over, studying the number she had scribbled hastily. She wondered if he'd called, wondered if he'd thrown it away, wondered if he was still there. She dreamed of him sometimes, not in the way that people dream of romance or rescue, but in flashes. His voice in the dark, the flicker of firelight on his face, the quiet weight of being seen. She didn't tell anyone about it. Not her co-workers, not the overworked therapist she saw once a month through a hospital voucher, not even herself, not in the way that made it real. On her next day off, she cleaned, not because she needed to, but because her body itched with restlessness. She scrubbed the tiles in her kitchen, organized the medicine cabinet, and rearranged the books she rarely had time to read. And in a drawer she almost never opened, she found something unexpected, a folded photograph, its edges worn from handling. It was one of the last she had of her brother Marcus. He stood on the steps of their old apartment in the summer heat, grinning, arms draped over a bicycle he'd gotten from a church donation drive. She stared at the image for a long time, her chest tightening. Marcus had been like John in some ways, stubborn, resilient, lost in the cracks. He had bounced from couch to shelter to jail and back again, chasing the ghost of a life no one had helped him build. She had tried to save him. She had stitched up his wounds, paid his bail twice, offered him her couch and her quiet disappointment. But she couldn't reach him, not in the way she had hoped. And when the call came, from the coroner's office, clinical and cold, she hadn't cried. Not then. Not at the funeral either. Only later, months later, in a patient's room with the door closed, when she realized she was bandaging the same kind of arm Marcus had once hidden from her. She pressed the photo to her chest and breathed through the ache. The past was never really past. It just waited, patient and quiet, until it was called back by something, by someone who echoed what had been lost. The next morning, she walked the long way to work, stopping by a corner cafe near the warehouse district. It was small, with fogged windows and a humming espresso machine that filled the room with warmth. She ordered 2 coffees and packed one into a thermal sleeve, along with a sandwich. Then, with the bag tucked under her arm, she made her way to the building she had passed days before. The door was closed. A padlock hung from the latch. Snow drifted high against its side. She knocked once, waited. Nothing. She walked around the back, found another entrance, unlocked. The inside was darker than she remembered. The heater gone, the crates scattered, no sign of life, no trace of John. She stood there for a long moment, clutching the bag, heart sinking. Maybe he'd moved on. Maybe someone had come. Maybe he hadn't made it through the last cold night. But on the floor, near where the heater had once been, lay something small and folded. She knelt and picked it up, a crumpled square of cardboard. Her hospital ID, the one she'd given him. On the back, beneath her number, someone had written, "Thank you. I see you too." She pressed the card to her chest and closed her eyes. That night, as the snow began to fall again, she lit a candle in her window and sat by the glass, watching the city fade into white. The voices of the past still whispered, but now they were joined by something else, a promise, perhaps, or the memory of being seen. And that was enough to keep her warm. The city was never truly quiet. not even under a heavy blanket of snow, but that morning it came close. Amara stepped out of her apartment and into a world transformed. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving behind a hush so complete it seemed sacred. The streets were still mostly empty, save for the occasional plow grumbling in the distance or the crunch of boots from someone trying to salvage the rhythm of routine. Trees stood draped in white, cars disappeared under rounded hills of ice, and the breath of the city came slow and shallow, as if recovering from something too vast to name. She moved carefully along the sidewalk, her bag slung over her shoulder, her scarf wrapped tight beneath her chin. The wind had softened, no longer biting but still sharp at the edges. As she walked, she thought of the warehouse again, not just the space or the firelight, but the feeling it had wrapped around her. Safety without condition, warmth without question. She thought of John, of his silence, his presence, and the way he had accepted her arrival and departure as naturally as breath. A part of her had wanted him to call. She had checked her phone more than once, caught herself glancing at the screen during slow shifts and bus rides home, half expecting a message that never came. But he hadn't reached out. Not after the note, not since. She told herself not to be disappointed. People like John weren't built for rescue stories. They didn't reappear with declarations or dramatic returns. They lived in the quiet, and when the world shifted again, they moved on. That was how they survived. Still, she couldn't stop looking. At the clinic, she moved through the morning like always, checking charts, greeting patients, dealing with a burst pipe in the lower exam room that had flooded the floor. She trained a new hire, a 22-year-old nursing student with more questions than experience, and a bright-eyed faith in the system Amara no longer shared. By lunchtime, she was already exhausted. But instead of heading to the cafeteria, she slipped on her coat and left through the side door. She carried another bag of food, coffee, a sandwich, a thermos of soup. She walked to the warehouse again, not because she expected to find anything different, but because something inside her needed to keep showing up. It was still empty. The crates were gone. The floor had been swept by weather or hands, she couldn't tell which. The only trace of him was the memory she carried. She stood in the center of the room and closed her eyes, letting the cold press around her like a question without answer. Then she left the food behind, placed carefully beside the wall where the heater had once sat, and walked back to work without looking back. That night, she dreamed again. This time, it was her brother. He stood at the foot of her bed, wearing the jacket he had stolen from her closet when he was 17, smiling that crooked, infuriating smile. He didn't speak. He never did in these dreams. He just looked at her, something soft in his eyes, and then turned, walking away into snow that fell upward like smoke. She woke with tears drying on her cheek. The next week passed in fragments. Early mornings, long nights, a growing ache behind her ribs she couldn't name. She worked overtime. She trained volunteers. She filed paperwork with tired fingers and smiled through check-ins with patients who could barely meet her gaze. And all the while, she kept returning to the warehouse. It never changed. One afternoon, after a double shift, she sat on the curb near the corner coffee shop and let her hands thaw around a paper cup. The sky had begun to darken early again, and the streetlights flickered to life like tired ghosts. A few blocks away, she heard sirens, a world still turning. She didn't hear him approach. He never did make much sound. When she looked up, he was just there. John stood a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of a different coat. Clean, too large at the shoulders, but newer. His boots looked unfamiliar, and his face was smoother, shaved. There was a bag slung across his back, the kind handed out by transitional shelters or outreach programs. He looked like the same man, and yet he didn't. Something had shifted in the lines of his posture, in the set of his mouth. He looked lighter. Amara stood, nearly knocking her coffee over. He said nothing at first, then nodded once. "I saw your note." She wanted to speak, but her mouth felt suddenly clumsy. She swallowed hard. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," she said. "I wasn't sure either." They stood there for a moment, neither one quite stepping closer. The wind picked up, brushing past them, tugging gently at her scarf. "Do you want to sit?" she asked, gesturing toward the bench nearby. He nodded again. They moved together in silence, settling on the weathered wood as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For several minutes they didn't speak. Then he said, "I took a bed at the Grace Shelter on East 35th, just for a few nights." "That's good," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "They've got a work program. I signed up, construction cleanup. Low pay, but it's work." She turned toward him, eyes searching his face. "Why now?" He was quiet for a while, then, "Because someone reminded me that I wasn't invisible." She felt her throat tighten. "I'm not trying to be a project," he added quickly. "I don't want to be something for you to fix. I know what that does to people." "I don't think you need fixing," she said. He gave a small smile. "That's the first time someone said that in a long while." They sat there as the sky darkened, the street lamp above casting a soft circle of gold around their feet. "I kept coming back," she confessed. "I know. You were watching. Once or twice. I wanted to see if you meant it. The number, the food, the note. I did." "I know," he said again, and there was no doubt in his voice now. She studied him. There were still lines of wear in his face, still the weight of years lived on the edge. But now there was something else too. A quiet steadiness. Not hope exactly, but a willingness to try. "Do you have a place to go tonight?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "The shelter gave me a voucher for a cot. They're full up, but they let me trade shifts for a spot." She didn't push. She simply stood, and he followed. As they walked, they didn't speak of the past, not of how they met, not of what had come before. They walked as two people who had touched the edges of something vital and returned not whole, but breathing. At the shelter, she stopped at the steps. "I'm glad you came back," she said. He looked up at the building, then at her. "So am I." He turned to go, then paused. "Do you want to meet for coffee again?" he asked, voice careful. She smiled. "Yes, I do." He nodded, then walked inside. She stood on the sidewalk a little longer, watching the door close behind him, before turning and making her way home. That night, as she turned the key in her apartment door and stepped into the warmth, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Not joy, not peace, but connection. And in a world that so often left people behind, that was enough. For now. The days that followed moved in slow, deliberate beats, like the ticking of a distant clock muffled by a snowfall. Life did not change suddenly, nor did Amara expect it to. The city remained what it had always been, gray in the morning, louder in the evenings, full of faces that rarely lingered long enough to remember. But beneath the surface of her daily routine, something had shifted, subtle and persistent, like the ground beginning to thaw beneath layers of ice. She no longer felt the same hollow weight as she entered the hospital each morning. The exhaustion was still there, inevitable and inescapable, but it no longer came with the same sting of invisibility. Her steps, though tired, held a trace of anticipation, and her eyes began scanning places and faces not just with a practiced efficiency, but with hope. She didn't always find him. In fact, for several days after their meeting outside the shelter, John didn't appear at all. She told herself not to expect him, not to cling to some fragile thread of meaning in their brief connection. People like him weren't always ready. People like her didn't always know how to wait without carrying the burden alone. But then he came. It was a Thursday, just after sunset, and she had finished a brutal shift in the ER. She stepped into the staff lounge to grab her coat and found a small paper bag on the table with her name written in neat block letters across the front. Inside was a coffee thermos, still warm, and a note scribbled in pencil on the back of a bus schedule. "You look tired. Figured this might help." No signature, no explanation. But she knew. From then on, they began to orbit each other more frequently. She would sometimes see him in the hallway of the clinic, helping janitorial staff carry supplies or mopping a spill in the waiting area. Once, she caught him fixing the handle on a storage room door, his hands moving with the quiet precision of someone who had built things that mattered long ago. He never made himself the center of attention. Most of the staff assumed he was part of the transitional work program. Only Amara knew how fragile the thread was that tethered him there. They started sharing small moments. She would bring 2 containers of soup instead of 1, leaving one near the staff entrance where he sometimes waited between assignments. He would leave folded napkins with her name on them or refill her water bottle if she left it behind. They didn't always talk. Often, they simply sat together in silence on a bench outside the clinic or near the bus stop where they had first collided with each other's lives. One evening, after a long rain that had washed the snow from the streets and left behind puddles reflecting dull neon lights, he asked if she wanted to walk. She nodded, and they made their way through the quiet city blocks, their footsteps rhythmic against the wet pavement. He didn't speak at first, and neither did she. It was enough just to move beside him, to feel the quiet warmth of presence without demand. Eventually, he spoke. He told her about his son. "Evan," he said, his voice flat but fragile. "He was 8 when I left. We were going to build a treehouse that summer. I never came back." Amara didn't ask why. She knew that stories like his were made of too many strands, too many failures woven tightly together, impossible to unwind without pain. "I've thought about writing to him," he continued, "but I wouldn't know what to say." "Maybe just start with, 'I'm still here,'" she offered gently. He gave her a glance, surprised, then looked ahead again. "Maybe." They stopped at the edge of a park where the ground was still soft with melting snow, and the trees stood bare and reaching. A bench sat beneath one of them, its metal frame rusted and damp. They didn't sit. Instead, they stood side by side, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. "Sometimes," he said, "I think I forget how to be around people. Like I don't remember the right pace to walk or when to talk or when to just exist." "You're doing fine," she replied. He turned to her, a faint line between his brows. "Why do you keep showing up?" She hesitated, then looked him in the eye. "Because you did." He didn't answer. But in the silence that followed, she felt something unfold. Something soft and uncertain, like the petals of a flower pushed too early into bloom by a stubborn sun. That night, as she unlocked her apartment and stepped inside, she noticed the smell of her apartment had changed. It still carried the scent of old books and reheated meals, but now there was something else. Something like cedar or dust warmed by firelight. A memory carried home on her skin. The weeks passed. One day, she saw him talking to the shelter director with a posture she hadn't seen in him before. Upright, shoulders squared, as if his spine had remembered the shape of purpose. Another time, she found a copy of a repair guide in the staff lounge, her name scrawled in pencil on the cover. "In case you ever need to fix something," the note inside read. She smiled at it for longer than she meant to, and still they didn't label what they were doing. There was no romantic gesture, no confessions, no touch held longer than a glance. But the care was constant, steady. She began to fold his name into her day without realizing it, began to expect his quiet presence like a heartbeat. Then came the day he didn't show up. She waited by the back door of the clinic for half an hour after her shift, soup cooling in her bag. The following day, she asked the shelter director if he had checked in. The woman looked uncomfortable, then shook her head. He left 2 days ago, said he had something to figure out. Amara felt the air rush out of her lungs. She nodded, pretending she understood. For the next several days, she moved through her work in a fog. She checked the warehouse. She asked around. Nothing. It was as if the city had swallowed him again. And then, on a Thursday afternoon, heavy with gray skies and slush-streaked sidewalks, she found a letter in her locker. There was no envelope, just a folded sheet of notebook paper with her name written in the same block letters. She unfolded it slowly, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean to disappear. I just needed to know if I could keep standing on my own. You gave me more than warmth, more than soup, more than kindness. It gave me a reason to try again. I'm not going far. I'll still be around. I'm just learning how to walk without leaning too hard. I hope you understand." There was no signature. He didn't need one. She sat down on the bench outside the hospital and stared at the letter until her eyes blurred. Later that night, she stood by her window, watching the city move below her. The snow had begun again, light this time, soft, falling like ash from an unseen fire. She pressed her palm to the glass and let herself miss him, not with desperation, but with gratitude. The next morning, as she walked through the hospital doors, her coat flaring slightly in the wind, she saw something taped to the staff bulletin board. A flyer for a community rebuild project. A call for volunteers to help renovate a neglected park shelter in the North District. She scanned the list of names. One stood out near the bottom, printed in firm pencil strokes. John M. She smiled, not because it made everything okay, or because it promised more, but because it meant he was still here, still walking, still leaving a trace in the snow. The final snow of the season came late, creeping over the city without fanfare, dusting rooftops and sidewalks in a thin veil that melted almost as quickly as it landed. By morning, only remnants remained, small clumps clinging to the edges of benches, the crooked grooves of curbs, the crevices between bricks where sunlight hadn't reached. It was the kind of snow that didn't demand attention, that fell gently enough to be forgotten, if not for the way it softened sound and held the air in suspension, as though time itself had paused to take a breath. Amara stepped outside with her hands buried deep in her coat pockets, her bag slung over her shoulder, and her heart thrumming with a nervousness she couldn't name. The flyer still hung on the bulletin board at the clinic, its edges now curled and stained, but the list of names intact. John M. remained where she had last seen it. She hadn't gone to the site yet. She had walked past it once, from across the street, watching people in work gloves and boots carry boards and buckets into what had once been a forgotten park shelter. She hadn't seen him, but she hadn't stayed long enough to be sure. Today, she was ready. The streets were quieter than usual, muffled by weather and early hour. She walked with purpose, but not haste, letting her feet carry her forward even as her thoughts pulled in every direction. It had been over a month since his letter. A month of glimpses, his name on a clipboard, a half-finished thermos with a familiar smell left near the entrance of the staff lounge, a folded blanket left in the donation bin with the tag removed but stitched with careful hands. No meeting, no voice, just traces. She had tried to let go, told herself that what they shared was fleeting, that some people entered your life to remind you of what mattered and then disappeared like snow. But something about the way he lingered, in the corners of places, in the silence between thoughts, refused to fade. The park came into view slowly, the path narrowing as it wound past leafless trees and broken fence posts now half repaired. The building itself sat at the far end, squat and square, with peeling paint half sanded and a new roof in progress. A group of volunteers huddled near the entrance, loading planks onto a dolly. She scanned their faces as she approached, her heart climbing higher with each step. Then she saw him. He stood to the side, clipboard in hand, one foot resting on a low stone, his brow furrowed as he reviewed a stack of papers. He wore jeans and a dark sweatshirt beneath a work vest, his hair a little longer than she remembered, but clean, his posture straighter. There was a line of exhaustion under his eyes, but the weariness that had once seemed carved into him had softened. He looked like someone who had remembered how to belong. She stopped a few feet away, uncertain if he'd noticed her, unsure whether to speak or wait. But before she could decide, he looked up. For a moment, they only stared at each other. The wind stirred between them, lifting a few strands of her hair and sending a loose leaf skittering across the pavement. Then, slowly, John smiled. It wasn't the cautious, closed expression she had first seen in the warehouse. It was something fuller, something real. He stepped forward. "I was starting to think you weren't coming," he said. "I was waiting," she replied, then paused. "I wasn't sure if you wanted me to." "I did." His voice was steady. "I just didn't want to ask. Not before I had something to show you." She looked around. The half-repaired roof, the cleaned-up grounds, the boxes of supplies lined neatly along the edge of the path. There were even flower pots waiting to be planted, their soil still untouched but ready. "You helped do all this?" He shrugged lightly. "A little every day. Someone gave me a chance. I figured I'd better make it worth something." She stepped closer. "You did." He nodded, looking down for a moment, then back up. "I thought about calling you a dozen times. I had your number memorized, still do." "So, why didn't you?" "Because I was afraid that if I called before I had something to offer, you'd see me as someone still trying to be rescued." She frowned gently. "John, I know," he interrupted, his tone soft but firm. "You never treated me that way. That's why I had to come to you different." She let the silence stretch for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small paper-wrapped package. Inside was a mug, a simple one, pale blue with a crack near the handle that had been carefully sealed. "I found this in the back of a cabinet last week," she said. "It's old, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it out." He took it in his hands, studied the repair, and nodded. "It's still good." "So are you," she replied. He looked at her again, and this time there was something unsaid that passed between them, an acknowledgement not of love, not yet, but of something deeper, a commitment to presence, a choice to stay. They spent the rest of the morning working side by side. He showed her how to secure the brackets for a new bench, She taught him how to lift properly to protect his back. They didn't talk about what they were building, but the rhythm between them filled in the spaces. Occasionally, their hands brushed. Once, she caught him watching her from across the lot, his eyes warm and full of a wonder he didn't try to hide. By early afternoon, the wind had picked up, and the last of the volunteers began packing tools away. She followed him around the corner of the building where the light fell softer and the noise of the street faded behind them. "I don't know what comes next," he said, leaning against the wall, arms crossed loosely. "I still have things to figure out. Still have nights where I want to vanish again." "So do I," she said honestly. "But I want to try," he added, "to be someone who stays." She reached for his hand then, her fingers wrapping gently around his. His grip was firm, grounded. He didn't pull her close. He didn't make promises with flowers or poems, but he didn't let go. They stood like that for a long time, the city humming quietly beyond them, the wind brushing past their faces, the ground beneath them no longer frozen but softening. Later, as they walked together toward the bus stop, not the one where they had first met, but another, equally ordinary, he glanced down at her. "You ever think about that night?" "All the time." "Think it was luck?" She considered. "No, I think it was grace." He nodded slowly. "I think it was snow." She smiled. "Beneath it, I found something I didn't know I was missing." He squeezed her hand once. "That makes two of us." And as they stood there, waiting for a bus that might or might not arrive on time, neither of them cared. Because in a world where people were so often left behind, they had found each other. And that was enough to begin again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. Watch our next video for another unforgettable journey, and be sure to share this story with someone who needs it today.